A cowboy took in his neighbor's abandoned mail-order bride and found unexpected true love in his life. Jack wasn't the type of man who liked a lot of fuss. He was a cowboy, strong and quiet, with a heart bigger than most people realized. His ranch sat on the edge of town, where the land stretched for miles in every direction. There was something about the isolation that suited him. He'd grown up here, worked the land since he was old enough to hold a plow, and though he often worked alone, he didn't mind it. Life on the ranch was hard. There were cattle to tend, fences to mend, and unpredictable weather to deal with. But Jack loved the land. It was in his blood. The days were long and the nights were even longer. He often found himself sitting alone on the porch after a long day, watching the stars and listening to the wind rustle through the trees. That was until one day when something, or rather, someone, changed all of that. It all started with the arrival of a letter in the post. It wasn't a letter for Jack. It was for his neighbor, Thomas. Thomas had been talking about it for weeks, about how he was getting a mail-order bride. The town had heard the gossip, and it seemed everyone was curious to see the woman who was coming to marry a man she had never met. Thomas had been alone for years. A rough man, a rancher like Jack, but not quite as soft in the heart. He had tried courting before, but it never worked out. He'd heard of mail-order brides and decided to try it. So, when the letter arrived, everyone expected it to be the beginning of something new. The town gathered in small groups, whispering among themselves about the woman who would soon be joining Thomas. There was excitement in the air. A new arrival always brought curiosity. Jack didn't pay much attention to the gossip. He wasn't interested in the affairs of his neighbor. He had enough to do on his own ranch. But everything changed the day Clara arrived. It was a bright afternoon, the kind where the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the land. Jack had been working out by the barn when he saw the dust rising on the dirt road leading into town. A stagecoach had arrived, and with it, a woman. She was young, with soft brown hair tied back in a simple bun. Jack couldn't help but notice the way she looked around with a mix of nervousness and curiosity. She had the look of someone who had just traveled a great distance, and though she was dressed in a simple, travel-worn dress, she carried herself with a quiet grace. As the stagecoach pulled up to the side of the road, Jack heard a loud argument. He couldn't quite make out the words, but he could tell something wasn't right. The door to the stagecoach opened, and out stepped Clara. Her eyes were wide with shock as she looked around at the small town, the dusty roads, and the sparse buildings. There was no excitement in her gaze, no warm welcome, just confusion. And then Jack saw it, the man who was supposed to meet her, Thomas, wasn't there. Clara stood there alone in the middle of the street, her suitcase clutched tightly in her hands. Jack could hear her voice, soft and trembling, as she asked the stagecoach driver where Thomas was. But there was no answer. The driver, who was busy unloading baggage, simply shrugged and nodded toward the small town. The silence between them hung heavy in the air. Clara stood there for a moment, her face turning pale as she realized what had happened. Her fiancé, the man she was supposed to marry, hadn't shown up. She was abandoned, left in a strange town with no one to turn to. Jack watched the scene unfold from the distance. He saw the desperation in Clara's eyes, the way she clutched her suitcase as if it were her only lifeline. He didn't know the woman, but something in him couldn't ignore her distress. She wasn't just abandoned by Thomas. She had been left stranded in a place she didn't know, with no friends, no family, and no idea of what to do next. He could have easily turned his back and continued working on his ranch, but Jack wasn't that kind of man. The town wasn't big, and everyone would know if someone didn't step in to help her. Jack didn't want to get involved. He didn't want to deal with someone else's problems. But he also couldn't stand the thought of a woman being alone and vulnerable, especially in a place like this. Taking a deep breath, Jack made his decision. He walked across the dusty road toward Clara, who was still standing by the stagecoach, looking lost and unsure of what to do. He didn't say much when he approached her, just offered a simple greeting. "Are you all right, miss?" Jack's voice was low, steady. Clara looked up at him, her eyes red from either exhaustion or unshed tears. She took a step back, clearly surprised that someone was speaking to her. She opened her mouth to say something, but her words faltered. I don't know where to go," Clara said softly. Her voice was full of emotion, a mixture of confusion, fear, and sorrow. He didn't come for me." Jack didn't need any more explanation. He could see it in her eyes. This wasn't just a story about a bride left at the altar. It was the story of a woman who had been abandoned by the man who had promised to take care of her. He could hear the heartbreak in her voice, and it made his chest tighten. He stood there for a moment, thinking. He didn't know what he could offer her. He wasn't a man of many words, and his ranch was small, but something inside him told him he couldn't just walk away. "You can stay with me," Jack said, surprising both himself and Clara. "I've got room on the ranch. You can stay there until you figure things out." Clara hesitated, glancing around as if looking for another solution, but finding none. She was exhausted and heartbroken, and she didn't know where else to turn. She looked back at Jack, unsure but desperate for some kind of refuge. "Thank you," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you so much." Jack didn't say anything more. He simply nodded and led her toward his ranch, feeling a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. He had always been a man of action, not words, but there was something about Clara's vulnerability that made him want to protect her. As they walked, Jack couldn't help but notice how quiet she was. She didn't speak much, and Jack didn't press her. He knew she needed time. She wasn't just a woman abandoned by her fiancé. She was someone who had trusted another man with her future, only to be left alone and unsure of what to do. The sun was beginning to set as they reached his ranch, and Jack showed Clara to the small guest room. It wasn't much, just a bed, a dresser, and a few simple furnishings, but it was clean and private. Jack didn't offer any false promises or grand gestures. He just made sure Clara had a place to sleep and a warm meal. That night, as Jack sat by the fire, he couldn't help but think about how everything had changed. He had never expected to take in a stranger, let alone a woman who had been abandoned by her fiancé. But there was something about Clara, something in the way she looked at him, that made him want to help her. He didn't know what would come of this, but he knew one thing for sure. His life had already changed, and there was no turning back. As the days passed, Jack and Clara settled into an uneasy rhythm. Jack was used to living alone, and though he had extended his help, he wasn't quite sure how to deal with a houseguest, especially one like Clara. His life had always been simple: wake up before dawn, work the ranch, and then take a moment to sit by the fire at the end of a long day. But now, with Clara in the house, everything seemed a bit different. Clara, on the other hand, was adjusting too, though it was clear she wasn't entirely comfortable. She had always imagined that her new life would be one of excitement and joy, starting a family with her soon-to-be husband. Instead, she found herself in a stranger's house, a man who had kindly offered her a roof over her head, but nothing more. She couldn't shake the feeling of being unwanted, even though Jack had been nothing but kind to her. Still, Jack could tell that Clara was a strong woman. She was quiet, yes, but there was a strength behind her eyes that didn't escape his notice. She had a calm way about her, something that kept her poised even when her world had been turned upside down. It was clear that Clara wasn't the kind of woman to wallow in self-pity. She was trying to make the best of her situation, even if she wasn't sure what that situation would be. The first few days, Jack let Clara get settled. He didn't ask many questions about her past, and she didn't offer much. He could tell she was still heartbroken over what had happened with Thomas, and he didn't want to press her. Instead, he focused on his work, repairing fences, checking on the cattle, and making sure the ranch was running smoothly. But something in the air had changed. It wasn't just the new presence in his house. It was something deeper. A quiet tension seemed to hang between them, an unspoken understanding that neither of them could ignore. One afternoon, as Jack was working in the barn, Clara came outside to help. She had never worked on a ranch before, but she was eager to pitch in. Jack had shown her the basics, how to muck out the stalls, feed the animals, and mend the simplest of fences. At first, she had been hesitant, unsure of herself, but over time she began to pick up the skills. That afternoon, Clara was walking around the barn, her hands full of hay for the horses, when she noticed Jack working on the fence. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden light over the land. Jack was kneeling down, hammering a post into the earth, and Clara couldn't help but notice how strong and focused he looked. There was something almost mesmerizing about the way he worked, his muscles straining as he drove the post deep into the ground, his brow furrowed in concentration. For a moment, Clara stood there, watching him, unsure of what she was feeling. There was a certain comfort in the quietness of the ranch, a peace that she hadn't felt since before everything had fallen apart. It wasn't the kind of life she had imagined for herself, but in some ways, it was the life she needed. The peace of the land, the steady rhythm of the work, it was grounding. It was helping her heal. Jack noticed her standing there, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just two people, caught in their own thoughts, sharing the same space. Clara finally broke the silence, her voice soft but steady. "I never thought I'd be doing this." She gestured toward the barn, the horses, the ranch in general. "I imagined my life would be different." Jack stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Life doesn't always turn out the way we imagine," he said quietly. His words were simple, but there was a weight to them, a recognition of how much life had changed for both of them in such a short time. Clara nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "No, it doesn't." She paused for a long moment and then added, "I'm sorry you got stuck with me." Jack looked at her, taken aback by her words. "Stuck with you," he repeated almost incredulously. "You're not a burden, Clara." She didn't meet his eyes. "I feel like one." Jack let out a long sigh, the kind of sigh that came from deep within, a mix of frustration and understanding. "I don't know what you're going through, but you're not a burden. I offered you a place to stay because it was the right thing to do. I'm not going to regret it." For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sound of cattle in the field. Then Clara spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her eyes meeting his for the first time in days. I don't know what I would have done without your kindness." Jack didn't know how to respond. He wasn't the type of man to be overly sentimental, but hearing Clara's words made something shift inside him. Maybe it was the fact that she was so vulnerable, so different from the strong, independent woman he had first met. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, as if he were a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. As the days passed, Jack began to notice more about Clara. He saw the way her face softened when she was around the animals, the way she quietly observed the work he did on the ranch. She was learning, adapting, finding her place in the rhythm of the land. Clara's presence, though quiet, began to fill the house. She started preparing meals, simple dishes but ones that made the place feel warmer, more lived in. At first, Jack had done most of the cooking, but Clara had quickly taken over the kitchen, and Jack found himself grateful for it. It wasn't that he couldn't cook, he could. But there was something different about coming home to a meal prepared by someone else, a meal made with care. It wasn't just the meals that changed the house. There was the quiet sound of Clara humming as she worked, the soft shuffle of her footsteps down the hall. Jack found himself growing used to her presence, used to the feeling of not being alone anymore. Still, Clara seemed to be holding something back. She rarely spoke about her past, about the man who had abandoned her, and Jack didn't press. He had his own wounds, his own struggles, and he didn't think it was right to pry into hers. But he could tell that, deep down, Clara was still hurting. She had been abandoned by a man who had promised to take care of her, and that kind of betrayal wasn't easy to forget. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Jack and Clara found themselves sitting together on the porch, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky. The air was cool, the kind of cool that made you pull your coat tighter around your shoulders, but it wasn't uncomfortable. They sat in silence for a while, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice low. "You don't have to stay, you know. If you don't want to be here, you can leave. I won't hold it against you." Clara turned her head, surprised by his words. "Why would I leave?" Jack shrugged, though the gesture seemed forced. "I know you're not here because you want to be. You're here because you have nowhere else to go." Clara looked at him for a long time, then shook her head. "You're wrong, Jack. I'm here because I don't want to leave. Not yet." Jack felt a shift in the air between them, a quiet understanding that wasn't there before. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something else, something deeper. A connection, fragile and tentative, but real. And for the first time since Clara had arrived, Jack didn't feel so alone. The days at the ranch continued to pass, and though Jack had grown accustomed to Clara's presence, there was still an unspoken tension between them. It wasn't awkward, but it was undeniable. They had found a comfortable routine. Jack worked the ranch. Clara helped out wherever she could, and when the day was done, they would sit on the porch together, watching the stars and enjoying the silence. But the quiet was starting to feel different. As the days turned into weeks, Jack began to notice things about Clara that he hadn't before. She wasn't just a woman who had been abandoned. She was a woman who had dreams, fears, and a quiet strength. There was a fire inside her, one that refused to be snuffed out no matter what life had thrown her way. Clara, on the other hand, was beginning to see Jack differently too. At first, she had only seen him as the man who had taken her in, the man who had offered her a roof over her head when she had nowhere else to go. But as she spent more time with him, she realized that Jack was more than just kind. He was steady, reliable, and fiercely protective of those he cared about. His quiet strength was a comfort, a solid foundation in the midst of everything that had been uncertain in her life. The more Clara worked on the ranch, the more she grew to appreciate the life Jack had built for himself. The ranch wasn't much, but it was his. Every piece of land, every animal, every building had been earned through hard work. There was something about the simplicity of it all that drew Clara in. The quiet rhythm of the days, the work that had to be done, and the satisfaction of seeing the fruits of their labor at the end of the day. It was a life that had meaning. But it wasn't just the work that kept Clara grounded. It was Jack. His silent strength, his calm nature, and the way he looked after her without ever asking for anything in return. It was something she had never experienced before, not with Thomas, not with anyone. There was no pressure with Jack. He didn't demand anything from her except for her company, and somehow that made her feel more at ease than she had ever felt before. One evening, after a long day of work, Clara found herself sitting by the fire, a cup of coffee in her hands. The sun had set and the stars were starting to fill the sky. Jack had gone to check on the cattle, and for a moment, Clara allowed herself to reflect on everything that had happened. She hadn't planned for any of this. She had never imagined that she would end up here, on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, living with a man she barely knew. But now, as she sat there, the warmth of the fire against her skin, she realized that maybe this was exactly what she needed. The pain of being abandoned was still there, a dull ache in her chest that never fully went away. But the longer she stayed with Jack, the more that ache seemed to fade into the background. Jack returned to the house as the night deepened, his face weathered from the day's work, his clothes dusted with dirt from the fields. He didn't say much as he entered, but Clara noticed how his eyes lingered on her for just a second longer than usual. There was something unspoken between them, a silent understanding that neither of them had voiced, but that neither of them could ignore. "Everything's good with the cattle," Jack said, his voice low. "I think we're in the clear for tonight." Clara nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. She hadn't expected to feel this way, but there it was. A connection had grown between them, something that was slowly, quietly taking root. It wasn't just the physical closeness or the fact that they spent so much time together. It was something deeper, something emotional. As the days went on, Clara found herself increasingly drawn to Jack. There was no dramatic confession of love, no sweeping gestures. It wasn't like the fairy tales she had read growing up. It was slower, quieter, like the slow but steady flow of a river cutting through stone. But it was real, and that was something Clara hadn't expected to find, not in a place like this. One afternoon, as Clara was working in the garden, pulling weeds from the soil, Jack came outside to join her. He wasn't wearing his usual work clothes but a simple shirt and worn-out jeans. He wasn't in a hurry, not like he usually was when he was fixing something on the ranch. He simply walked over to where Clara was working, his boots making a soft sound against the ground. "I thought I might help you out today," Jack said, kneeling beside her. Clara looked up, surprised. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Jack replied with a smile. "But I want to." For the first time in a long while, Clara smiled back. There was something about Jack's presence that made her feel lighter, like the weight she had been carrying for so long was starting to lift. Together, they worked in the garden, talking about little things. Jack spoke about his life on the ranch, about the lessons he had learned from his father, the struggles he had faced, and how he had learned to take care of the land. Clara listened, fascinated by how much he knew, how much he had done on his own. She had never really thought about the work that went into running a ranch, but now she saw it with new eyes. As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself sharing more than she ever had before. She told Jack about her life before the mail-order bride incident, about growing up in a small town, and about her hopes for a future that now seemed uncertain. She told him about Thomas, how she had thought she was marrying the man of her dreams, only to be abandoned before they even had the chance to meet. Jack listened quietly, offering no judgments, no suggestions. He simply listened, and that was enough. For Clara, it was more than she had ever gotten from anyone else. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone to listen to her, someone who didn't just try to fix things but who simply heard her. By the time they were finished in the garden, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the land. The air was cool, but the work had left them both feeling content. As they walked back to the house, Jack's hand brushed against Clara's. It wasn't intentional, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her. Clara looked up at him, surprised by the brief contact. Jack didn't say anything, but his eyes met hers for a moment, and in that brief exchange, Clara could see something in his gaze, something more than just kindness, more than just friendship. She couldn't quite place it, but she knew it was there. That night, as they sat together by the fire again, the silence between them felt different. It was still quiet, still comfortable, but now it was filled with something unspoken, something that neither of them had acknowledged, but that both of them knew was there. Jack was the first to break the silence. "You know, you don't have to stay here forever if you don't want to, but I can't deny that I'm glad you're here." Clara looked at him, her heart swelling in her chest. "I'm glad I'm here too, Jack, more than I can say." And in that moment, Clara knew that her feelings for Jack had shifted. She wasn't sure when it had happened or how it had happened, but she knew that she had begun to care for him in a way that went beyond just gratitude or friendship. She wasn't ready to say it out loud, not yet, but she knew that she was no longer the same woman who had arrived at this ranch, lost and broken. She was changing, and Jack was a part of that change. As the weeks passed, Clara felt something shifting inside her. The ranch, which had once seemed like a place of isolation, had become her home. The quiet, steady rhythm of life on the land gave her a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She worked beside Jack every day, feeding the animals, fixing fences, and keeping the place running. Slowly, the pain from her past began to fade, replaced by a new kind of hope. But there was something else, something that Clara had tried to ignore. The feelings she had for Jack were growing stronger. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It wasn't just the kindness he had shown her. There was something deeper between them, a connection that neither of them could ignore. Jack had been nothing but patient with her. He never pushed her for more than she was ready to give. He never tried to force anything between them. But Clara could feel it in the way he looked at her, the way his presence filled the empty spaces in her life. He had become more than just the man who had taken her in. He had become someone she trusted, someone who made her feel safe. And in time, she realized that he was someone she cared for deeply. One afternoon, as Clara worked in the garden, pulling weeds from the soil, Jack came out to check on her. He had been working in the barn all morning, his clothes dusty from the work, but there was something different about him today. He had a quiet tension in his movements, a sense that something was on his mind. Clara noticed it as soon as he walked up to her. "Is everything all right?" she asked, looking up from her work. Jack hesitated for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. For a second, it seemed as though he was going to say something but then held back. "Yeah, just been thinking about things." Clara paused, sensing that this was more than just a passing thought. She stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. "Thinking about what?" Jack looked at her for a moment, his eyes scanning the open space around them as if looking for the right words. "I don't know." "About the ranch. About you." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had been avoiding the conversation that she knew was coming, the conversation that would change everything between them. She had always known that Jack had a past, just as she had hers. But she hadn't realized until now how much she had been hoping that this would never have to be addressed. "Jack, what are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to hear the words that she feared would come next, but she knew they had to be said. Jack looked down at the ground for a moment, as though gathering his thoughts. "I don't want you to feel like you have to stay here, Clara," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I've enjoyed having you here more than I can say, but I know that you didn't come here because you wanted to. You came here because you had nowhere else to go. I don't want to hold you back if you need to move on, if you need to find your own path again." Clara's heart sank. She had never wanted to leave, not for a single moment. But Jack's words hung heavy in the air between them, creating a space that felt colder than it should have been. "Jack, I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want you to feel obligated to stay because of me," Jack interrupted, his voice softer now. "You're free to go whenever you're ready. You've helped me more than I can ever repay, but I don't want you to stay out of guilt or pity." Clara stared at him for a long moment, the words she had been afraid to say hanging in the air. She hadn't realized until now just how much she had been holding back. She hadn't realized just how much she had come to care for him, not just as a friend, not just as a man who had been kind to her, but as someone who had become essential to her life. She stepped closer to him, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Jack, I'm not here because I have nowhere else to go. I'm here because I want to be." Jack looked at her, his expression uncertain. "But you don't have to stay here, Clara. You could still go back to town, start over somewhere else. You deserve to have your own life." Clara shook her head. "I don't need to start over. I have everything I need right here, with you." There was a moment of silence, a long stretch of time where neither of them said anything. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, the sounds of the ranch carrying on in the background. Jack looked at Clara, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to understand what she was saying. "You don't have to pretend, Clara," Jack said, his voice quiet but serious. "I'm not asking you to stay because you feel like you owe me anything. If you want to leave, I'll help you. But I can't have you stay out of some obligation." Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the moment she had been afraid of, the moment where everything could change. But instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of calm. She knew what she wanted. She had known for a long time. "I'm not pretending, Jack," she said, her voice strong now. "I'm here because I want to be. I don't want to leave. I don't want to be anywhere else." Jack's eyes softened, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out not for any grand gesture but just to touch her. It was a simple touch, just enough to let her know that he understood, that he felt the same way. "I'm glad you're here," Jack said quietly, his voice steady and sure. Clara looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't want to go anywhere, Jack, not now, not ever." Jack's hand lingered on her shoulder, his gaze still fixed on her, and for the first time Clara felt truly understood. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found something here, something that felt real, something that she had never expected to find in the most unlikely of places. Jack didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with everything that needed to be said. There was no need for grand declarations. No need for anything other than the quiet understanding between them. The ranch had become their place, their shared life. And for the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. But even as the day went on and they went back to their usual routines, Clara knew that things had shifted. There was an unspoken promise in the air now, a promise of something more. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that Jack was a part of it. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the way his hand still rested lightly on her shoulder, in the way she had never felt more at home than she did in that moment. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, Clara felt ready to walk it. And with Jack by her side, she knew she wouldn't have to walk it alone. The days had a way of blending together on the ranch, each one flowing into the next with a quiet steadiness that seemed to ground Clara in a way she hadn't expected. The work was hard, the days long, but there was a rhythm to it, a calmness that Jack had shown her. She had always imagined that her life would be full of drama and excitement, that her marriage would be a whirlwind of romance and adventure. But instead, she had found something different, something deeper. She had found peace. Jack had become more than just the man who had given her a place to stay. He was the person she now turned to when she needed advice, when she had a question about the ranch, or when she simply wanted to talk. In the quiet moments, when the work was done and the sun set behind the hills, she would find herself sitting next to him on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. Clara had come to understand something important. Jack didn't need grand gestures or promises of forever. He was content with what he had, and he had made her feel like she was a part of that. There was no rush, no pressure. They were building something together, slowly but surely, with every passing day. One evening, after a long day of work, Jack had asked her to come with him to the barn. Clara had been surprised. He usually worked alone out there, but tonight he wanted her to join him. They didn't speak much on the way there, but there was something in the air, an unspoken tension that neither of them had addressed. When they arrived, Jack turned to her with a quiet smile. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice steady but soft. "I think it's time we take this thing to the next step." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She had felt the same way, but she hadn't known if Jack was ready. The last few weeks had been an unspoken promise between them, a quiet acknowledgement that they had both found something in each other that was worth holding on to. But now, standing there in the dim light of the barn, Clara realized that Jack had finally said the words she had been hoping for. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack took a deep breath, his gaze steady on her. "I don't want to just work alongside you, Clara. I want to build a life with you. I know we didn't plan for this, and I know we didn't expect it, but I can't imagine this ranch without you here. I can't imagine my life without you in it." Clara's heart swelled with emotion, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. She had never expected Jack to open up like this, to share his feelings so openly. He had always been quiet, reserved. But now, standing in the barn with him, she could see the sincerity in his eyes, the depth of his words. "I've never expected this either," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I never imagined I'd end up here with you. But now I don't want to be anywhere else. I don't want to leave." Jack smiled, a small but genuine smile that made Clara's heart flutter. He reached out and took her hand, the warmth of his touch sending a wave of comfort through her. "I don't want you to leave either, Clara. I'm not asking for anything big, just for you to stay, just for us to keep doing what we've been doing, but together, for good." The words hung between them, simple yet profound. Clara knew that this wasn't just about staying at the ranch. It was about building a life together, about trusting each other with the future. She had come to this ranch broken, uncertain of what her life would be. But now, with Jack's words and the promise in his eyes, she knew that this was the place she was meant to be. "I want that too," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "I want us to build a life here, together." Jack stepped closer, closing the space between them. His hand gently cupped her cheek, and for a moment the world seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing in the barn, a quiet promise hanging in the air. Jack leaned down slowly, his lips brushing against hers in a soft kiss. It wasn't a passionate, fiery kiss, but one that was full of tenderness and understanding. It was the beginning of something new, something real. When they pulled away, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had spent so much of her life searching for something she couldn't define, something she thought she would find in grand gestures and fairy tale endings. But now she realized she had found it in the quiet moments, in the simple life she was building with Jack, in the love that had grown between them, slow and steady, like the land they worked together. Over the next few days, things between Clara and Jack felt different, but in the best way possible. There was no rush, no need for grand plans. They were simply living their lives, hand in hand, working the ranch together, talking and laughing and sharing quiet moments. And that, Clara realized, was enough. One morning, as Clara stood by the barn, looking out at the fields, Jack came up beside her. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, gazing out at the land. They didn't need words. The connection between them was deeper than anything either of them could express. It wasn't about the work, the ranch, or even the future. It was about being together, about sharing their lives. "You know," Jack said after a while, his voice quiet, "we've come a long way since you first arrived." Clara smiled, turning to face him. "Yeah, we have." Jack looked at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I never thought I'd find someone who'd stick around this long, but I'm glad you did." Clara laughed softly, a sound that felt as natural as breathing. "I'm glad I stayed, too." They stood there for a while, enjoying the peace of the moment. The ranch was quiet, the air still and fresh. There was a sense of contentment in the way they stood together, side by side, without saying a word. It wasn't a life that anyone had planned for, but it was a life they were both building day by day. As the weeks turned into months, Clara and Jack's bond grew stronger. They worked together, faced challenges together, and supported each other through the ups and downs of ranch life. And through it all, they had come to realize something important. They were more than just two people living on a ranch. They were partners, building a life together, creating something that was uniquely their own. Clara had found more than just a place to stay when she arrived at the ranch. She had found a home, a future, and a love that she never expected. And as she stood beside Jack, watching the sun set over the fields, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. She didn't need anything more than this. She had found exactly what she was looking for, and she didn't have to look any further.